I learned years ago that I was being called to become Jewish. And you may wonder, how could you possibly know that? How could you know you want to convert to a new religion? And I would say, these are fantastic questions that I would love to answer in a different TED Talk. For now, believe with me that I was being called to become Jewish. I started working with Rabbi Rapport, who I met here at Bellarmine, to learn as much as I could about Judaism, to ask as many questions as I could, and eventually it was time for me to pick my Hebrew name. Now, most people will pick their Hebrew name based on their secular name, but those options just weren't quite doing it for me. So, Rabbi Rapport encouraged me to do some research and find stories of Jewish people whose name I might like to carry on. After a couple conversations, looking through the Jewish Women's Archive, and then stumbling into a couple different World War II timelines, I met Regina. Regina Jonas was born in Berlin in 1902 in a poor Jewish neighborhood. Her friends recalled that from an early age, she talked about wanting to become a rabbi. The only problem being that no woman had ever been ordained a rabbi before. Still, she was set on the seemingly impossible task from the moment she started school. Fast forward through her schooling during World War I, and Germany looks very different from the one she was born into. In 1930, Regina wrote her graduate thesis on the topic, "May a Woman Hold Rabbinic Office?" It was the first known attempt to find a halakhic basis for the ordination of women, and halakhic just refers to Jewish law. Her opening and closing statements sum up her sentiments well. In opening, she wrote, "I personally love this profession, and if ever possible, I also want to practice it." She concluded her thesis, "Almost nothing halakhically but prejudice and lack of familiarity stand against women holding rabbinic office." Having found an ally in her plight, Rabbi Edward Baneth supervised Regina's thesis and graded it good. But unfortunately, he passed away soon after. And Edward's successor, Rabbi Honeck Albeck, was unwilling to ordain a woman as a rabbi, so Regina graduated as a religious teacher and was not ordained. Still, she did her best to serve her German Jewish community. By April 1933, when Jewish students began to be banned from public schools in Germany, Regina's world began to change very quickly. But despite her increased teaching workload, she continued to fight for her ordination. In 1935, after 5 years of service and continued self-advocacy, Rabbi Max Deinemann agreed to her ordination, and Regina Jonas became the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. She would do her best to serve her German Jewish community for the next 7 years through her pastoral work, all while watching the continued rise of the Nazi regime and having her world close in around her. And in 1942, Rabbi Regina Jonas and her mother were deported to Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt was a Nazi propaganda machine, cleaned and painted beautiful enough to pass a Red Cross inspection in June of 1944, despite having thousands of people crammed into the walls and attics of the buildings with no access to proper hygiene, medical care, or food. While Theresienstadt was not a death camp, thousands of people died there due to the squalid conditions. Even then, though, Rabbi Regina Jonas was one of the first faces to greet new arrivals and introduce them to the limited resources of the ghetto. She gave lectures. She cared for her neighbors. She offered spiritual guidance and comfort, all while living in a literal hell. In October 1944, Rabbi Regina Jonas and her mother were deported to Auschwitz and were likely killed the same day. They were 7 months away from liberation. Several of her contemporaries survived their time in Theresienstadt, including the former leader of German Jewry, Rabbi Leo Beck, and the psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl. Despite having lived and worked alongside Regina, they never spoke of her. In 1972, Sally Priesand became the first woman to be ordained by a rabbinical seminary. The Berlin Wall still stood, guarding the only records that we have of Regina. It wasn't until 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, that the very few writings we have of Regina were found in the archive of German Jews in East Berlin. And Regina was found to be the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi 17 years after Sally Priesand. In August 2021, I became Jewish and took my Hebrew name, Regina. I swore that I would never let her story disappear again. As long as I am on this earth, we will not forget a woman brave enough to become the first female rabbi while living in Nazi Germany. But in order to best carry her name, I felt called to see the places that she had lived. So in July 2022, thanks to a program called Melton International, I was blessed to visit Berlin, Prague, and even Theresienstadt, which is a place that people do still call home today. But it was a difficult place for me and my travel companions to be. The air felt thick and heavy, and the feeling of eyes peering at us was constant. Regina's name was nowhere to be found. Not on a plaque, not in the museum, not even in the hidden synagogue, a place so hidden that even many of the Jews detained in Theresienstadt did not know it existed. I had hoped to feel traces of her boundless energy there, but I could not find her. We moved on to Berlin, and on a street no different than any other, we came upon a plaque indicating the house that she had grown up in. A few paragraphs about her life, one of the only photos that we have of her. Even then, I looked for her up and down the street, in the windows, in doorways, in the faces of my fellow travel companions, but I couldn't feel her. I couldn't see her. She was gone. I had hoped to feel an ounce of her energy lingering in the streets that she had called home. Some quiet whisper on a Berlin breeze to say, "Here I am." I felt like I hadn't come any closer to Regina than I had before I left. But despite the pain of staring history in the face and the anxiety of standing on the ground that so many lost lives had called home, I felt myself growing, steadying in my identity. When I looked in the mirror, I felt like I looked more like myself than I ever had before. I was more self-assured, grateful, more spontaneous to grasp every last moment that I have. I realized weeks later that I had been looking for Regina in all the wrong places. I had been looking for her in windows and doorways of old buildings, when she was really waiting for me in the mirror. Regina wasn't gone. She was in me. I and all of my Jewish friends here tonight are evidence of her legacy. The quiet voice I had hoped to hear on a Berlin breeze turned into a steady voice, a confirmation of her memory in someone destined to remember. My voice speaking for us both, saying, "Here I am, Regina." Even beyond the grave, Regina continues to spiritually guide me, and she empowers me to be fearlessly Jewish, to not let history dictate my callings and my future. So the next time you need to remember someone brave, you need to channel some chutzpah, some audacity, remember Regina. Tell her story. Imagine a woman so powerful, just the idea of her can enliven your spirit and bolster your identity. And she knew the vastness of her work even then, as she wrote, "Our work here in Theresienstadt, serious and full of trials as it is, also serves this end, to be God's servants, and as such, to move from earthly spheres to eternal ones. May our work here be a blessing for the future of the Jewish people and the future of humanity." Rabbi Regina Jonas.